this is a little bit about me. I'm a clinical psychologist trained abroad, but I'm also a counselor. So this is a little bit about my background, and you're welcome to have, yes, you can have a copy of my presentation. I think Lorna is recording it, and then you can have a copy of it. No problem. There's just a little bit of background, and then you can read a little bit of my background here. So just a little reminder, if anything that we discussed today makes you feel unwell, I do suggest that unwell emotionally, I mean, don't struggle with it. Do contact your GP, and there's some numbers here. And if you can't wait for a GP appointment, do contact the Samaritans or Shout. Shout is a very good support system that you can text, so you don't have to talk to somebody. So sometimes we don't know about this number, but it's good to know. So what is trauma? We start with what is trauma. It's the way that you see yourself, you see the world, and you see others, and that has been changed completely by a stressor and a traumatic event which causes stress. So there's a huge gap between what you believe and what the trauma has caused you to see. And then at this point, the severe feelings of helplessness come in. And that stress is caused by the severe feelings of helplessness. So you have to understand that it's not the intensity of the event that is, it's not proportionate to the intensity of the event. So some people will have different events happening to them, and people will deal with that differently. So some events may be traumatic to some people, while the same event may not be traumatic to other people. And that's very important to know. So one example of how trauma can be formed, being fired from a job. The identity of somebody is formed by being at work. Work gives self-esteem, gives purpose in life, gives your social network, and also gives most of your daily activities. So when you get fired from a job, it's a traumatic event to you. And then you have feelings of helplessness with that, because you just can't do anything about it. So your body goes into this hypervigilance state. When you start having physical and emotional symptoms, like you get poor sleep, you get depressed, you get anxious, you start getting flashbacks about what happened, and you get nightmares, which are the symptoms of a post-traumatic stress. How do you recover from that? You have to start finding a new meaning for yourself, so you can work through the trauma. That's what a lot of us here have done when you actually leave a job and go into self-employment. So I thought that was a relevant example for us. What happens when there's mass trauma? When the same event or series of events traumatizes many people at the same time. And that normally will have a war, a terrorism attack. But actually, COVID is actually quite a textbook case. But it doesn't have the graphic or the accelerated intensity that those two cases of war or terrorism. And I'm going to show you why. The first one is bereavement, but it's a traumatizing bereavement. It's bereavement on a huge scale. And when we talk of bereavement, when you talk about death, death is always traumatizing for the loved ones that stay. And there's also the rapid deterioration of COVID symptoms. You also have restricted hospital visits, which is traumatizing for the loved ones. You can't follow what is happening to the people that you love and they're in hospital. So you don't have time to prepare for what is happening, or you don't have time to prepare for possibly their death. The funerals have been socially distanced and cut in head count, and rituals are extremely important when it comes to the trauma of death. The continual reminder of the virus can trigger difficult memories and constantly re-traumatize the person that lost someone. Getting sick in a very traumatic way. You need hospitalization possibly when you get the virus, if you have a severe case. You might have brushes with death. It can actually be so serious that you need hospitalization. And the people around you are very traumatized by that experience as well. And the symptoms of the illness can be so serious that it's quite traumatic for you or for those around you. Not to mention that the symptoms themselves include being unable to breathe, which actually Metin Basoglu, one of the founders of the trauma studies at King's College London, was saying that is one of the most traumatic events that one can imagine, being unable to breathe. And I can agree with that, because when I first had asthma, I found one of the most traumatic experiences not being able to breathe because I didn't know what it was. So I can agree with that. It affects the entire population. It doesn't discriminate. So the fact that it's the entire population being affected is traumatizing. It also causes what is an interoceptive fear. We start noticing our body all the time to see if we're having symptoms. We keep assessing, do we have symptoms all the time? And that's traumatizing. Lockdown is incredibly traumatizing. Our rhythm of life is disrupted. Our year becomes distorted in time. Some people name it as the year of fog. It generates this agoraphobia about going out in a lot of people, which is traumatic. It generates a confusion. When you go out, you don't know quite how you should behave, and you don't know what you suspect. You don't know if it's safe to go out. And that's traumatic. Now we're going to talk about recession, unemployment, and remote working in mass. So bankruptcy, unemployment, life plans ended. Your plans, all holidays, all of those plans, they all gone up in the air. And when you had looked at the recession of 2008, they looked at how the spike in mental health went. The prediction of this recession is that the spike in mental health is just going to be completely up in the air. The transition to remote working can be, and you don't notice, people think, oh, it's really good, but it can be subtly traumatizing because people don't always adapt to their circumstances. So they have to reshape themselves. Now, children, this is quite important because they're more sensitive and they can view the world as something terrifying now. And they're growing up thinking that my parents aren't coping, the world is unsafe, and that the people that should be looking after us aren't doing their job. So if this carries on, it could be what we call an intergenerational phenomenon. Because these children will grow up and they will have their own children, and they can transmit this trauma through their own behavior, through their own beliefs. And their fears will be transmitted. And then who knows what will happen, how the next generation will be. Now, this is the last part in terms of thinking about the trauma that we're looking at, the society that we are at the moment. Healthcare workers, they have an additional element of trauma, which is called moral injury. They have to decide who lives or who dies because they have lack of resources. That's an incredible traumatizing experience. Now, there's a pressure on the mental health infrastructure as well, because if thousands of people worldwide are traumatized, that puts an enormous pressure on the mental health infrastructure. That pressure on mental health infrastructure of people with depression and anxiety unable to work will put pressure on the social and economic society as well, because that will mean there will be more people on job seekers allowance or ESA and unable to produce for this society as well. So what is this trauma is not dealt with? I call it processed, but dealt with. What if you don't do something about it? If the individuals, they will have fits of aggression and anxiety. So they will act out, or they will actually withdraw because they will be so afraid of being re-triggered by the trauma, by the circumstances, that they will be avoidant, because that's what you do when you're fearful. You don't want to be triggered again by the trauma. So agoraphobia, for example, you just don't leave the house anymore with the fear of being re-traumatized. And in the group level, there will be violence and aggression, followed by a withdrawal because you're terrified of being re-traumatized. And we've been seeing groups of aggression. We've seen it in America. We've seen it with the race, the race group. What's it? I'm terrible with the names, but we've seen it in aggression everywhere, in groups of aggression. So there are recommended means. These are my recommended means of how to process trauma. And for individuals, there's counseling, there's psychotherapy, there's art therapy, there's body therapies. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what there's a counseling and trauma system, the way I work with counseling. And very briefly, very briefly, I work with Herman's 3-stage method. Stage 1, you deal with the now issues. So depression and anxiety, because you don't want to re-traumatize anybody. When that is dealt with, then you look at the trauma. Then you create a narrative, a new narrative. Yeah, I'll put it in the box for you. Okay. Integrating with the life story, mourning for losses. So you create the new narrative, creating with life story, and then moving on to the future or stage 3. So you recreate, the goal is to recreate the narrative, looking at what happened and mourning for the losses that you've had. So you can move on to the future again with a new narrative for yourself. So this is my conclusion. The conclusion is that it's a mass trauma with a damage potential. So COVID-19 is a mass trauma with such a trauma damage potential that we've just a few times in history, we've seen it. Our building blocks of reality have changed completely. So everything in this COVID area is different. And everything has a potential of traumatic effects. But all pandemics do end, and so shall this one. So there is a positive there. But we cannot forget that there was a trauma. So we need to overcome it and process it for our mental health's sake, for our sanity's sake. So these are the references that I've used. This is a good article to read. It has a bit of long words, but it's a good article to read. And that's the theory book I use. And now it's question time.
Okay, well,